to all the researchers in advance because this will not be scholarly. I'm glad I'm in the middle between the two, but I come to the work in a different way. And I'll just attempt to talk through the experience we had working on the Smith 2 house, because I think it's important to understand that that ultimately the way in which we think about the work, the legacy, the preservation of Arthur's work, is interconnected not only to the critical footholds that and concept that Arthur brought to the table, but also what are the impacts of the users moving forward in order to protect the building. And it's exciting when one can unearth a series of quotes that reinforce and entrench the notion that that Arthur felt strongly that the user was the critical informant to the way in which the building was to unfold. Maybe I'll go back here for a second to just quickly. You'll not get what the level of history in regards to the project on purpose, and I'll explain that moving forward. But effectively, a 1,600 square foot building, West Vancouver, constructed 63 to 66. $35,000, reported to be pretty much in on budget because Marion would not allow it to be over budget, as I've learned. So just to contextualize the piece, Arthur met Gordon and Marion in 1940 and made their first house in 53, the Smith 1 house, Erickson, Massey. Important. That is a house that effectively, I'm not here to talk about today, but as I understand it, is a house that had an Erickson rigor to it that we won't see moving forward in the Smith 2 house. Arthur traveled through Japan in 61 on a Canada Council grant. 63 receives a commission for SFU. I place that off the side to begin to talk about the kind of work that is being done simultaneously to the residential work, because I feel that there is a narrative around test studies in the residential work that precede an earlier work. There's others here that can confirm that beyond myself. 64, the Smith 2 house happens. After that is the MOA project. And one can begin to see a lot of commonalities between the type of structural propositions, the tectonics that are laid out in the Smith 2 house, in the MOA project. And then critical to the story I want to tell is that Marion and Gordon asked Arthur to consider a painting studio as he outgrew the space and was being confined with the studio in the main house. And Arthur flatly said no, that there should be no other building on the property. So a new type of experimentation occurs where other architects start to enter into the equation, looking to those critical footholds in the building, and Hollingsworth Architecture takes on 1989 work. 2021, we're fortunate to be brought into the conversation. I think it's important to understand that Arthur thought a lot about the way in which the buildings were integrated into the site, and how the diagnosis of the site would allow for placement to the building to protect the best parts of the site. This is an early walkthrough that Arthur would have had of the site. Simply put, there is 2 rock outcrops with a view out to the ocean and a fern-covered rift in between. So effectively the building is being thought of on that site, Cowboy Corner, pushed into the corner in order to save and preserve the best parts of the site for viewing and on-look, both short view, long view propositions. And this is how the house lays out. So as many of us hopefully have been to the Smith 2 house, but this is how it unfolded initially. It was quite a modest proposition, and does not have all of the terracing that one would see now. And I think that's quite important. This is a workerly house. It is a house that I think has a type of austerity to it that I think helps land this premise that not only is the site an informant, but the need sets and the limits of the ownership help constrain Arthur's vision. And again, a critical quote, it starts to build this notion of a schism that, while the demands of the site and the family are paramount in the development of a site, it does still clash with this notion that Arthur felt that the project was complete and that he did not feel that changes should be made to it. So that sets up something interesting, because I think the power and presence of that building did allow for others' involvement with deep respect. So I introduced Marion and Gordon. I was going to show a picture of Marion, but I think this is far more appropriate. That this was Marion's house. The second house was a house that was meant to have a type of edit, so I understand. And I think you can begin to really see that in the house. You can begin to see it in the way in which the austerity and building materials, construction techniques, etc., are played out. And I think that the honesty of that has definitely been an informant for our firm in the way in which one can grapple between coarse meets fine. Some of the critical things in the design that are of importance, if you look at the earlier work of the Baldwin House in '63, you begin to see a narrow column proposition placed on a thickened post condition. And I think that my read in regards to this, because I don't do a deep dive into this, I'm simply trying to understand it, understand this enough to move forward with the work as an architect, is that there was a goal to try and begin to bring the post and beam into a unification in order to allow for it to recede and become a backdrop for the inhabitants and the work of two critical makers, a weaver and a painter. And this quote sets up the notion that while there appears to be a rigor when one looks at the space and this helix that develops in the building, that he wasn't bound or paralyzed by that rationalism, that he allowed for a flourish to occur, and he never let structure dictate. So here's an example in the dining room that, in order to complete the need to create a space that's containing, maintains a certain type of massing, he introduced faux beams in the house as well. Nerve-wracking, as I'll allude to further, because sometimes you don't know what structure and what isn't when you're in a remediation strategy, as we've learned. There is conversation that Arthur alluded to, that he, and I think it's this tea house in Kyoto, where he was incensed by it because it had 3 different landing points of a column. One was on a log, one was on a rock, one was on the ground plane, and it pissed him off. And because it didn't show a level of rigor, and he said he was going on a hunger strike until he figured this out. But it later dawned on him that it was the site specificity that began to dictate and allow for him to loosen up his approach. And I feel we begin to see that stance taken up in the work of the Smith II house, in that he utilized it as an organization for a series of moments or nodes within the house, each playing to different sites of view, whether it is a studio proposition upon entry, or a dining room view to a terrace, a living room back into the forest, or a bedroom tight into an intimate condition with the forest. And I believe this comes out of that initial fury in Kyoto about, why would an architect break from rigor? So this is sort of where we begin to enter the picture. That think about the what is the fundamental role of this building? And it was very clear that this was meant to be a place for hosting, and whether it hosted Pierre Elliott Trudeau in his fine baby blue leisure suit, or whether Arthur, as many of you had a chance, he was able to continue to bring people together, to utilize architecture as backdrop, as a leap point for future conversations. And I'm happy that on the far right, that my client, that really the new stewards of the building, the Smith II House, has been entrusted to Dinah and Andy, and they too consider this space to be a working vessel to support ongoing conversations in architecture and art. Michael Prokopow, dear friend, helps immensely, not only in his comments in regards to the Smith II House as being thought of not as a shrine or something that we need to preserve in a state of paralysis, but something that we can think of as a building that has fundamental purposes, but can and is strong enough to handle a type of interrogation to ensure that it remains relevant and successful over time, and as a host. The work that Hollingsworth did in 1989 is the painting studio that Arthur said could not be, modifications to bathrooms, studio expansions, and the landscape terrace that is so critical now to the work that to the gathering that, as you saw with Dinah and Andy. And these are some of the shots of the work that Hollingsworth had done. That became really important for our entry into the equation, because Dinah and Andy had thought that road had been paved and they could develop a similar relationship with Measured to begin to think about the building as Gordon and Marion did with Hollingsworth. Scary proposition, terrified. We have projects that often you'd think of a historic house as a host for contemporary interventions. And I'll say that the presence and power of the Smith II House kept us in line, and I felt absolutely satiated to look. Well, Donald Luxton's here in the room. He has been a guiding light for our firm in regards to the notion that one should always look for the canvases that are always available within any project. And sometimes they're non-meritorious interventions that have taken place over time, or sometimes there's just simply antiquated spaces that no longer serve the critical functions that would ensure that these buildings make it through time. So our firm, my connection through to Arthur is not that I knew Arthur, I met him, but it's learning Arthur's lessons through Bing for effectively a decade. My business partner, Piers, was fortunate enough to get those critical foundations out of Shim and Bridget Shib Sutcliffe, and we were very lucky to have that kind of rigorous foundation. So with that, we're thankful that we've been entrusted to stabilize the patient of the Danto residence, the Smith II House, as we've talked, and beginning to work on the programming of the Erickson House and Garden. Robin, who owns the Danto House, said to me that she kind of thinks about owning an Erickson house in a similar manner as one might have a need to restore a painting. She has a corner painting that's sublime. She took it in to get it restored and found out the price of the restoration was 4 to 5 times the cost of the painting, but it was worth it for her to do it. And she said, that's why I want to fix Arthur's damn house. But this brings some, I quake in my boots, because I got to bring A game to any type of intervention, because I got to answer to that person, and that could be a scary day. And while I have David Kovo's guiding hand at all times of how to think about how our firm can come to the work of the preservation of Erickson's work and legacy, there's a rigor in Phyllis's interrogation of what the role is. And I'm largely sitting on the foundation to answer that question to next generations of makers. Why is this important to do this? And it's important, when I spent time with Dinah and Andy talking about the Smith 2 house, they asked a really tough question. They said, had the building lived out its life, should we carry on to restore the painting? Or has it done its job and we should take it down? And they needed to answer that question in order to remain invested in what those canvases were to move forward. Because this is, I'll call it an experiment in structural propositions, but the reality is I think it was more of a free-form proposition. This is an image of a rotted fascia board under the main living complex. We pulled it off and to repair it, and found out that this stuff is stick built. Like, these are layers and layers of scrap material bound together, and that fascia board was structural. So there's no roadmap for that. So we learn as we go. Unfortunately, in this scenario, fortunately, the building immediately began to smile with the elimination of this, but we were able to save the single paned plate glass. It made it all the way through until an individual was starting to work to clean the putty off of it, and he ticked it, and the whole thing blew. So we have now worked to create a roadmap for splinting over time. So we repair one piece, and then they have the specification to fix the remainder. But what was important is we wanted to understand what the house needed. What did the patient need? What are the places in the building that needed to be preserved in order to maintain the vision of the original project? And then what are the need sets? These are the lists from the client, and there were a lot of lists. And we had to begin to think about how to bring those together in a manner that did not undermine or disrupt the primary dwelling proposition. But we wanted to make sure that the canvas was open so that the client could carry on, because this is an Erickson house, but it's also Marion and Gordon's house as well. When they entrusted Dinah and Andy to take over the house, the last thing they said to them is, make it yours. And that was incredibly important because, as I'm receiving, I don't know if there's any members of the Erickson family here, but I got phone calls. Thank God you're on the case. I hope you're going to do everything in your power to revert the building back to its brine finish, that Gordon and Marion could no longer maintain because they were aging in place and they couldn't put this slurry on. So they painted it green, and that, in conjunction with handrails and pulls for Gordon, the decision was made that this is as important as the Erickson house to work to celebrate those layers. But meaningful conversations took place with Michael about, should those handrails come off? What we landed on is that the critical long views needed to be preserved, but that the voice of Marion and Gordon should remain, and then the canvas should be opened up to the next generation. So this is the work that Measure did. Here's the original Massey Erickson kitchen of '64, the Hollingsworth kitchen that was deemed to be antiquated, and then a goal to bring forward a contemporary proposition that might utilize some of the materials that Arthur would embrace if he had them available, as an example, a Vancouver Island marble, but working sensitively to look to the cues of the original building. But client wanted to talk about what are the colors, so these were some of the studies in different colors to the building. But ultimately, we landed on this in order to bring the coloration of the outside in, and to align with Michael's wishes and goals of the house to ensure that the island that you see in the long view axis is on wheels and can get the hell out of there in order to allow for flexibility of use, but allow for the house to revert back. We filled in, there's an artist in residency program, so this was a filling in of the utility sink for for the studio and the creation of a bathroom so that the house could continue to operate as a place for artist and resident. These are some of the cleanup shots once we finished the work of tidying it up, and I hope we did what we could in order to maintain and preserve it. These are shots before the furniture went back in, complete with Gordon and Marion's green stain. Sorry, Jeffrey. So the last shots. So to entrench and conclude, my supposition is that while Arthur may not have wished for someone else to touch the building in such a profound way over time that Hollingsworth did and we were involved in, I do believe that the site and the building were strong enough and had enough cues within it to allow for next generations to continue to evolve the building to ensure that it doesn't hit landfill. Thank you for listening to that.